introduced our last speaker for this evening. Her name is Isabelle B. She is a strategy and operations leader with over 15 years experience working with teams around the world on monetization, marketing, sales, and product strategy. She is currently heading up international strategy at OpenTable and previously was at Eventbrite and Square. She is first-generation American and has been based in the UK, Canada, and Spain, and has worked with teams in 12 different countries. She loves to travel, eat lots of delicious food, seeing a common theme here, and tries to go to as many concerts as possible. Let's give a warm welcome for Bianca, or Isabelle, excuse me.
Hopefully this works. Hi, guys. Clicking. All right. So I'm Isabelle, and I'm going to talk to you today about non-linear paths and embracing them. So I don't know about you, the world's changed a little bit, but when I was little, this was my perception of what a career was. And the web barely existed yet, but if it had, maybe a career path would look something like this, or maybe like this. And I wanted to be a creative director at a magazine. So for me, the path looked something like this. But there was one small problem. So this is a saying that my mom always told me, which I think is attributable to many different philosophers and gurus, but I just attribute it to Mom. Wherever you go, there you are. So this was me around that age that they start asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm not just showing you this to prove that I used to be tan, but I was, apparently. But wherever you go, there you are. And where I am in this picture is truly the foundation of who I am and what I've carried with me wherever I go, and I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But first, a wise friend, whose name is here, whose story I encourage you to look at because he's quite an inspiration, recently told me this. And it's both a positive and a negative, and yet combined. And the story that I'm about to tell you today, for me, has really been both a positive and a negative, and yet combined. So what you see behind me is called a duplex. And it's a type of trailer home that's divided in two, and one family lives on one side and another family lives on the other. So I lived on one side with my mother. And my reality was not the same as my vision for myself, right? So this was my vision for myself, but this was my reality. And not to say that that was necessarily a bad thing, but I truly believe that happiness is the delta between expectations and reality. And I was unhappy for many years, and I was resentful for many years, until I eventually learned to change my expectations, and that ultimately changed my reality. But we'll get to that in just a second. So flash forward several years, off I go to college. I'm proud to say I got a scholarship to a great school, and my expectations at this point are like here. But then reality kicks in, and I realized, and at the time, keep in mind, social media didn't really exist yet. So at the time, the path towards becoming a creative director at a magazine was to first start as an intern at a magazine. And being an intern at a magazine is not paid. And at this time, I'm working 3 different jobs. I can't afford to just quit and take an unpaid internship, so I'm really upset. But again, I don't realize this until later, it's both a positive and a negative, and yet combined. So why am I telling you this? This is my cousin, who I call my sister, and she's the founder of a really awesome app if you're looking to meet new friends. But she often tells me about this concept, which I really love, which is called problems of good fortune. And it's this idea that if I have a problem or if I'm unhappy about something, how can I reframe it to really see it as just the fact that I have this problem can be a luxury? So I'll show you some examples. For instance, I'm fighting with my mother could become, how lucky am I that my mom is even alive for me to talk to? I'm frustrated, I have to work late tonight. How fortunate that somebody respects me enough that they trusted me to do this assignment. I'm stuck in traffic. Isn't it so lucky that I have somewhere to go? What if I never got to go anywhere? So maybe not all things, but many things can become this idea of problems of good fortune. And you see, in my mind, there was this barrier, right, between where I was and where I wanted to be. But it took me years to realize that a lot of the things that we perceive as barriers can actually be the path to get us to where we want to go. And so I encourage you to reflect on that for a minute. How can you look at the barriers in your life as potential paths and the problems as potential problems of good fortune? And what are those for you? And that's what I mean by embracing. Let's talk about nonlinear. All right, so I'm doing all these different odd jobs, but remember, my dream is still to be a creative director. And I finally get myself a job on the design team of a magazine. And I'm like, woo, I'm on the path. Hooray. And it's not a fashion magazine or an art magazine. It's actually surfer magazine, and I don't surf. But it's still a magazine, and the team is really cool, and I'm like, this is awesome. What could possibly go wrong? And so this is in 2008. Who remembers what happened in 2008? I hear a lot of, yeah, the economy crashed. Bye-bye, publishing industry. They couldn't afford to pay me. And I think you get the theme from earlier, right? I had to get paid. So I had to leave, and I was, as you can imagine, a little disappointed. So I'm looking at this, and I'm like, man, how am I ever going to get to here if I can't even make this work? Like, maybe a dream job just isn't in the cards for me. But like I said, it's a positive and a negative and yet combined. And I was seeing the negative, but let me show you what the positive was. So I had a job as an entry-level sales rep, and I was cold calling people all day, but I learned how to get somebody to not hang up on me, and I learned how to negotiate. And I was a receptionist, and I learned how to talk to people from all walks. I talked to CEOs, I talked to media figures who would come into the office, just as much as the cleaning staff. And so you get the idea. Each experience taught me a critical skill that I didn't necessarily see at the time, but that makes sense now in hindsight. And I encourage you, even if you're in a nonlinear experience and you don't see the value at the time, see if you can start to connect the dots, because I think many of these experiences you'll find made you into the person that you are today. And my grandpa used to say that the path usually makes sense in the rearview mirror, which I completely agree with. All right, let's talk about paths. So remember what I said before about some things that seem like a barrier can actually be a path. Okay, so like I said, it's 2008, 2009. I can't get a job anywhere, even with a degree, major barrier. So I'm like, okay, well, those who can't do teach, you know that expression? So I'm gonna teach. So I start a small business as a private tutor, and I'm teaching foreign language classes, and I get a lot of business, and so then I'm bringing on other teachers, and it's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden we kind of have a little bit of a school. And then one of the parents of one of the students is like, hey, can you guys do some translations for my company? And we're like, okay, yeah. And so then we kind of have a translations agency. And then, one of the companies is like, hey, can you guys help with my go-to-market strategy into this new region? And we're like, yeah. So then we kind of have this like consulting firm, and everything's going pretty well. And so this lasts for about 3 years, and then move forward to 2011, and the crisis starts to catch up with the rest of the world. And so companies stop expanding internationally, parents stop hiring private tutors, and it all starts to fall apart. And I'm like, oh man, what am I gonna do next? And the feeling's really overwhelming. And around this time, I started writing a book, which I will hopefully publish one day, called Everything I Need to Know About Life I Learned in High School Math. And this is one of the chapters, which I read to myself, which is this idea that 0 equals 0. So even if it's times 1,000,000, it still equals 0. There is no way to get 0 and turn it into 1 or 1,000 on its own. And when we're at the start of something, really all we have is 0. But all around us, there are these people who have something. Some have a little and some have a lot. And it's your job to convince them to give you 1. So using a real example, let's say that you have $0 and I have lots of dollars. If I give you $1, you could invest it, right? You could see a return potentially. You could spend it on something. You could turn it into much bigger things, because 1 times 1,000,000 does not equal 0. It equals 1,000,000, which is the beauty of positive numbers. But the question really isn't, how do you get to 1,000,000? The question is actually quite simply, how do you get to 1? How will you get one person to believe in you? How will you convince that one person? Because I really think it only takes one person to help you get to the next step in your journey. You just have to get to one. So I won't tell you the end of the story because I'm out of time, but you can see it on my LinkedIn. So for the past 8 years, so 2011 to today, I really learned to embrace the winding path, to appreciate the skills I acquired, even when I didn't quite know where the path was going, and to really focus on finding that one person who would believe in me and help usher me into that next step, whatever that next step was for myself. And I'm not a creative director, as you can tell from my title, but I have had the opportunity to work for some pretty amazing companies. I've actually worked in every department at a company except for legal and engineering. So it's been crazy, but an awesome experience. And I kind of have a dream job. So just remember, wherever you go, there you are. And that's both a positive and a negative, and yet combined. And these are all problems of good fortune, because the path will make sense in the rearview mirror, and it only takes one person to get you to the next step in your journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. Who would like to be the first question? Any questions? Alrighty, here we go.
Hi, I just have a question on your quote when you say it takes one person to to get somewhere, and sometimes as women we do have that imposter syndrome. So once you have that person who uplifts you and then gives you the chance to get towards your dream job, how did you manage to go ahead and swim in that ocean and fight the sharks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I still have imposter syndrome a lot of the time. I had imposter syndrome for a long time. And I think the reason that I had it was because there was this difference between the reality that I knew, right? Part of which I just shared with you, and I think what people looked at me as. So I've worked in a lot of countries around the world. The first thing that people see is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl from California. So they start making assumptions. Frequently they ask me, oh, you must be neighbors with Brad Pitt. I'm like, not exactly. So I think that for a long time, the challenge in convincing somebody to believe in me was that I didn't believe that I was okay just being the me that I was. I felt like I had to masquerade as this person that people thought that I was. And I think that once I realized no, it is okay to just own it and to own my experience, I think that people respond to that authenticity and they want to help you get to wherever your experience is. And I think you feel more comfortable accepting the help, which I think is the other challenge. We have imposter syndrome, but we're often afraid to ask for help and then afraid to accept it. So I think for me, that was the change that allowed me to move forward.
Thank you. Any other questions? We can take one more question before we jump into the end of our presentation and the networking portion. Don't be shy. All right, here we go.
Hi, Isabelle. Thanks for sharing your story. I'm curious, kind of on the theme of what Sugi asked, of how did you identify those people that became your sponsor when you were, navigating such different paths? So it's easy, if you know all the people, all the players, but when you show up somewhere new, how do you identify someone to support you?
I agree with what was said earlier. You kind of just have to get out there. So it's funny because I can actually name who all of those people are, but some of them found me, and some of them I met years ago, and it wasn't until the moment that I knew them that I was like, wait a second. I met somebody one time who might be a path to this thing. That's actually how I got my job at Eventbrite. So I don't know if I was always super strategic. I mean, I agree that sometimes you do have to do the research, right? And you do need to kind of figure out what are the events that these people might be at? How do you start to get to know those people? But I think sometimes you might just have them in your personal network. They might be a friend. They might be a friend of a friend. They might be somebody that you had coffee with. And I think it's just a matter of, the challenge for me is keeping track. So I've actually started being a lot more diligent with notes when I meet people, because I think one, it's just good to remember facts and things about that person, because it engages them and allows them to know that they left an impression on you, right? Because you remember things. But then two, later on, you can be like, I know somebody who worked at this company, and then I search in my notes and I'm like, that's who it was. And then I'm like, hey, can I get some of your time to ask you about your company? Because I'm considering applying for a role there.
Thanks, guys.